Hello, it's just David here with my weekly video. Read a book recently, which is a very interesting one. It's a book called Humankind. It's this book, and it's by a Dutch social scientist, Rutger Bregman. And he seeks to really answer one of the great sort of fundamental questions, which is really, are human beings fundamentally good or fundamentally bad? Now, we all know we're a mixture. We can do great things. We can do wonderful and kind things and loving things. And we can also do incredibly hurtful and damaging things. And, as we come to sort of COP26 and all the rest of it, this is very much at the forefront of our minds. But his question is, what assumption should you work on? Should you work on the assumption that the mass of people will do bad things and need to be kept under control, or that the mass of good of people will generally do kind of good, loving things, and it's just a few people who ruin it? Now, of course, this is a theological question, and perhaps ones where Christians don't have particularly good records. The biblical account is suitably balanced, as I've described. God created the world, and at the end of it, he says everything is good. Then we have the story of the fall, and there's that sense of the image and the likeness of God being somehow clouded in humanity, so much so that we need a saviour to bring us back from that condition of fallenness and sinfulness. So far, so good, but I suppose the question still comes is, where does the balance lie? And I think Christians have been pretty negative. Augustine coined the phrase of massa damnata, or mass of perdition, or mass of the damned, to describe sort of humanity in its kind of now natural fallen state. And I think probably that's the assumption that's challenged in this book. Now, you might think, well, this is hatefully naive. You just need to turn on the news to see, what terrible things people are capable of. And I say that's true. It's not this guy or myself are saying that, human beings don't do terrible things. It's about the balance and about the assumptions we make and about how we act on that. Because, of course, people have long said, that's what makes the news. The news is news because it's unusual. There's a quote in here from the guy who made Love Actually, Curtis, isn't it? Richard Curtis. He says, if you sort of come out with make a sort of realistic film about some sort of, horrible hostage situation in which, a woman is kept kidnapped or something in a dungeon. Well, he says, the film gets, the critics say, well, it's gritty realism. And he said, well, that's probably happened, 3 or 4 times in the history of the human race. He says, you make a film like Love Actually, which obviously is sort of a lightweight, jolly rom-com about people falling in love, and millions of people fall in love every day. And you get told that it's not terribly realistic. You're living in sort of cloud cuckoo land. So that's perhaps a good guide that, actually the news focuses on the unusual. It doesn't focus. Perhaps if we all went about being utterly nasty to each other, we would, and then somebody was, incredibly kind and generous to somebody else, then that would make the news. And he goes through some of the things that you might immediately jump into. He goes through Golding's Lord of the Flies. He goes through various sort of social studies experiments. There's a famous Stanley Milligan and the shock machine experiment. I don't know if you know, that's the one where they all kind of are supposed to be giving electric shocks to other people. And actually he kind of goes through them and finds out that the results we thought we knew are not as straightforward as it seems. And so his conclusion, I say it's obviously quite a sort of long book, I can't go through it all, is that, and I think this is the fundamental thing, it's not so much, is it 60, 40, 70, 30, but it's what assumptions we should make in the way that we live, in the way we order our society. And I think this is the most interesting point of the book. And it's something that's come up quite recently, hasn't it? So if you take sort of many of our institutions, and the church is not least amongst them, but there are others, the police force, etc. There is a question: is how should you design institutions? Because we know that institutions, bad things have happened in them. I mean, there's an awful case of that police officer recently, of course, and you know, is that one of a few bad apples? And what you need to do in your institutions is design rules to make sure that those sorts of things can't happen. Or should your assumption be in institutions be that really everybody's in the take, nobody's really doing their job, and it's just a matter of magnitude between the person who murders somebody and the person who's just sort of cheating the system a bit. Everybody's kind of out to kind of for themselves to do their bit. Of course, that's the assumption behind the whole kind of market system of economics, of course. Is that everybody is basically looking for the best deal from themselves, regardless of the consequences of the rest, and that's the kind of the rational consumer. And of course, it's been shown that actually the rational consumer in real life, and this is one of the problems for economists, is rational consumers aren't that rational. We don't always work on those principles. But coming back to that sort of idea of institutions, I think if you look at, and some I've been very closely associated with is, so the church, obviously, but also schools and how they're ordered. I've had a lot to do recently with the social care services, and also people have health services as well. He talks about, and I suppose the question he asks in all of these sort of huge institutions and things, I mean, is, as I say, do you work on the principle? If you look at the health service, for instance, obviously we want rules to catch the sort of the awful, the Harold Shipmans, the really incompetent physicians. In the police force, we want to catch out those who are really, corrupt. In the church, we want to catch out those who are really abusing children, etc., etc. So obviously, he says, you need to have rules and stuff. You need to have standards, etc., etc. So you need to check up on these things. But the point is, where's the balance lies, and what he says, that if you look at the things, if you look at the health service and the way there's more and more managers, and managers basically sort of checking up because they don't trust the physicians and they don't really trust the nurses, and it's the same in the social care system, as I say, which I've had a lot to do with, lots of form filling and checks and balances, because they're slightly on the assumption that unless they're watched and harried and managed, nobody will do their job properly. And he shows actually this just isn't true. That actually there's plenty of evidence to show that managers don't represent great value for money in the health service. That too many schools inspectors don't particularly make schools any better. Etc., etc. And he quotes, for instance, I mean, there's a company in which it's a social care company in which they have very, very basic, checks and requirements to make sure that people do their job. But the assumption they make as a care agency is that most people who go into it want to care and will go the extra mile to care. And actually, what you don't want to do is to sort of put barriers in the way, and you don't have a load of targets and different definitions of care. You just say you've got this many hours to go and care for this person as best as you can. And I think this is true. I see in the church very creative people. I see in schools particularly very, very creative people who are absolutely committed to sort of educating children, have some really bright ideas, but are just under lots of pressure to kind of report back, because almost as though people are trying to trip them up. As I say, I don't think there's anything wrong with having measures of how well children are doing in school and making sure that you've got basic checks to make sure there aren't bad or dangerous teachers. That's fine. But the point is that the assumption behind those should be actually most are excellent, most are going above and beyond. Same with doctors, the same with clergy, dare I say. Same actually with MPs, etc., those in public life. And I think that's the point that he's making, that in all these things, you design the institution, you design the rules on the assumption that 95% of people will be going above and beyond and will be wanting to do more and wanting to do the good thing. And okay, you've got to do something to stop the 5% and particularly the very dangerous 1%. But that's as far as it goes. That's how your assumptions should work. And sometimes, dare I say it, the kind of some of that 5%, well, if you miss them occasionally, that'll be compensated because you've got the 95% of teachers who are, working extra hours and working weekends. If you've got then sort of 3% of teachers who, are slightly skiving off a bit early, actually that's outweighed by those who are doing all that. So you should, in a sense, not that it excuses it, but you should just live with that, and the fact that, well, maybe there aren't enough, tests. And I think there's plenty of examples of this. And I came across somebody in our congregation, I mean, sadly, who's now died. I won't mention who it is, but I always remember them that when they took over their firm, and this has been shown again in the book, that it was a traditional firm where people clocked in and clocked off. And it's a sort of manufacturing firm. And when he took over the firm, he just said he was just gathered together and saying, "Look, I'm taking out these machines clocking on. When you come in and when you go out. When you're supposed to be, and what you're supposed to do, and when you're supposed to go home. I'm trusting you. Don't let me down." It's quite a reasonably sized firm, so he knew most people in it. And there's case after case that this book demonstrates actually productivity goes up rather, and of course you remove all the cost of all the bureaucracies and the managers and the machines and etc. etc. So actually, everybody wins. Just working in the assumption that if you talk to people reasonably, they will be on your side. They'll see the points and they'll make the firm work better. So it makes good economic sense apart from anything else. And of course, somebody once said to me who was very much, I think, sort of, pretty sort of diehard capitalist, that actually, of course, communism does work. It works very much in families. I mean, in small groups, in households and very small neighbourhoods and groups. Of course, people are quite capable of working out how to best use their resources. And they ought to just be able to get on with it. I mean, this is the interesting thing, isn't it? That we in these things like social care and schools and church, have loads and loads of checks, etc. And yet, when people come home to their family, they don't sort of say, right, we're going to have somebody to manage who's doing the housework and the cooking and the washing to make sure everybody pulls their weight in this family, and we're going to have targets, and we're going to have an outside advisor, and and some sort of punishment or whatever for those who fail to meet their targets. It'd be ridiculous. I mean, if you had a family like that, maybe some do. There'd be not family I would want to be part of. It's naturally assumed that you don't need those things, that people will pull their own weight. So as I say, it is a balance, but it's a very interesting balance, and it's a very interesting book, and it's a very interesting question for our institution and also our attitude to it. There is a feeling, isn't there, that when it comes to things like the health service, Parliament, the police, social care, etc., etc., and I include the church in this, it's very easy to be a bit sneery, I think, and to work on the assumption, particularly from the outside, that it's not a very good institution, that they're all people who work are all a bit suspect. And as I say, it just isn't true. And as I say, this isn't just me saying what I'd like to think or making up a world I'd like to believe in. I mean, this guy goes through the kind of scientific data very, very carefully, and people do studies of these things all the time, and shows that actually, these are bad assumptions. They don't make sense. They don't make churches, hospitals, whatever, better places. that actually, if you want to make them better, economically more fulfilling, then yes, to checks and balances. Yes, of course, to catch out the bad apples, which undoubtedly exist. But yes, also to just allowing other people just to flourish without too many sort of managers and corporate people interfering. So there we are. There's my message for today.